Before Monkey D. Luffy declared that he would become the Pirate King, before Roger actually became the Pirate King, way before Dory and Brocky started their duel, infinitely earlier than when Emmet attacked the Holy Land of Marijois, prior to the birth of the oldest known giant, dwarfing the age of the Void Century, and even predating the calendar system as we know it. Before all of the things it is that I just said, the One Piece world lived in an era known as the Age of Heaven. This was a period characterized by deities living in a single nation known as the Land of Gods, the most well-known denizen of which being the Sun God. However, these gods gradually disappeared from the world, transitioning into the Age of the Sea Circle, an era dominated by humanity. But even though we can't see them, the influence of these gods still exists within the world today, and some of the gods themselves may even still be lurking on this planet. This is the story of the Age of Heaven, a time period which, quite frankly, we know frighteningly little about. And I know what you're gonna say, internet man, if we know so little, then why does this video still have ever so long to go? Well, look, it'd be a lot shorter if you just stopped asking questions. Many One Piece fans, even those who have been reading for decades, are often shocked to find out that One Piece world history actually follows a surprisingly strict and detailed calendar. In fact, it's so specific and detailed that I can give you the exact years and even days of many key events. For example, the raid on Onigashima took place on March 17th in the year 1524, almost exactly 2 years after Ace's duel with Blackbeard on Banara Island, which occurred on the 22nd of March in the year 1522, which was about 2 weeks after Luffy defeated Enel on Skypiea on March 10th, which itself was a mere 6 days after Luffy defeated Crocodile and ended the Alabaster Civil War on March 4th, which in and of itself was exactly 1 month after Luffy set sail from Fuchsia Village to become the Pirate King and started the journey that has consumed and enhanced many of our real-world lives. That is where the story of One Piece begins, but it's not where the world begins, not even close. And every now and then, what Eiichiro Oda does is he drops something. Clumsy Oda, he drops these tiny pieces of information to reveal just how colossal the scope of this world truly is. One key incident being chapter 228, when Nami read Nolan's logbook and gave us the exact date. Nami said that the entry was dated as the Age of Cayenne, 1120, June 21st, which Nami then says was 400 years ago, meaning that this moment on Jaya, and in fact all of pre-time skip One Piece, took place in the year 1520, except that is wrong, and Nami was using 400 years ago as an approximation. And we only truly discovered what year it was when Nolan's flashback began, which the narrator both said was 400 years ago and took place in 1122, meaning that pre-time skip One Piece took place in the year 1522. And this is the nexus point that we can use to discover and approximate the date of any event, past or present. Not present. It should be pretty obvious when the present taking place. I think I meant past and future. I'm confusing myself now. I'm gonna move on. Because we do run into a very intriguing problem when we reach the year 0 in the past. Because we know that recorded history has existed in the One Piece world for at least 4,000 years, because that was when the Palace of Alabasta was built, which is a bit tricky because the skilled mathematicians among you may have realized that 4,000 is a much more bigger number than 1,500, meaning that we've got a lot of history unaccounted for by the Age of Cayenne. And that's because everything prior to that time period is covered by the Tenreki, which means sky calendar and is also referred to as the Age of Heaven, which is a time period first mentioned by Nico Robin during Alabaster. And the small pieces of actually recorded knowledge that we have from this era come from Robin as well. She recites the history of Alabaster during the Age of Heaven, with brief events such as Kahira conquering Alabaster in the Year of Heaven 239, or the completion of the Great Taf Temple in Erumalu in the year 306, and she also mentions a hero named Mamudin who existed in the year 325. However, all of this information is currently of questionable reliability, because when reciting this, Robin, well, she was improvising. She was pretending that the Alabaster poneglyph contained nothing but ancient history, and certainly not the location of the ancient weapon Pluton, no. So we could certainly disregard these names and details. However, I do think it's highly likely that what Robin is saying is accurate. She spent 4 years working with Crocodile to target Alabaster and cause their civil war, and in that time, I imagine that the very history-hungry Nico Robin would have devoured every last fact about Alabaster, and that cultural knowledge could have greatly assisted Baroque works in understanding how to use Alabaster's history and customs against its own people. TLDR, we don't know if anything she was saying was true, but it probably is. And here, what Robin was doing was pulling from her factual knowledge to make her lie about Pluton sound more convincing. However, while the exact details about Alabaster's history are questionable, the existence of the Age of Heaven is not. Alright, so let's make sense of this. Before talking about Heaven, the Age of Cayenne is pretty criminally undertranslated in the official English. I know that a lot of people prefer names to stay in Japanese, myself included, for most of the time. For example, I definitely prefer not to call Inuarashi Dogstorm, just doesn't sound as good to me. However, the Age of Cayenne is a case where this word needed to be translated as literally as it could be and shoved straight into your internet watching faces, because it gives away such a massive part of One Piece history. Firstly, it's not just Cayenne. The full term is Cayenne Reki, literally meaning the sea circle calendar. This is the calendar system that we currently follow, and thus One Piece takes place in the age of the sea circle. And if you haven't figured it out already, here's the reason why we needed to hear this as literally as possible. Because the key geographical feature of the One Piece planet as we know it is the Red Line, a continent that circumnavigates the globe and forms a massive circle, which is juxtaposed by the literal sea circle that is the Grand Line, a stretch of water that also circumnavigates the planet. And so the implication here is that prior to the age of the sea circle, the Grand Line did not exist, at least not as we know it. And whatever was created or naturally formed is when the sea circle calendar began at year 0, as well as the year that the Age of Heaven officially ended, which is very, very similar to how the Japanese creation myth plays out in Shinto chronology, which is a lot like a very stylistic Big Bang theory. It claims that all matter at the beginning of the universe was compressed into the shape of an egg that began to move and separate into 2 distinct planes. The lightest particles within the egg reached the top of the universe, and they combined together to form the first clouds known as the Takamagahara, literally meaning the high plane of heaven. Meanwhile, the other particles that were too dense to rise sunk to the lower part of the universe and formed the plane of existence that we, mere mortals, attempt to enjoy to this very day. And after this happened, Shinto claims that we entered a period known as the Age of Gods, which I believe is the inspiration for Oda's Age of Heaven. And the topic of gods in One Piece is one that's brought up far more frequently than you may realize, and a lot of modern struggles in this world can be boiled down to a clash of gods or a clash of humans who claim to be gods. And so here is the hypothesis. During the Age of Heaven, these gods actually existed in some capacity, or at least figures who were impactful enough to earn the title of god even if they weren't literal gods. This of course includes the sun god Nika, which the sky people, Lunarians, buccaneers, and giants all at the very least have their own form of, but also the forest, rain, and earth gods who have been historically worshipped and mentioned in One Piece as well. Among others, many others. The term god comes up in One Piece far too commonly to list every example in this video. But as the legend goes, these gods may have lived in a single society at the top of the Red Line, because Whitebeard once said that the Red Line was known as Kami no Kuni, meaning land of gods. And furthermore, Queen also stated that the Lunarians who once occupied that realm were once recognized as gods themselves. Quite specifically, Queen said, that guy, being king, is a remnant of the extinct Lunarians, a monster capable of surviving in any natural environment. In the distant past, his people were known as gods. And then Sanji took a bit of a mid-battle break to ask a very poignant question, which is that, well, if those Lunarians are so good at surviving, then why are they all dead? To which Queen snapped back that Sanji should go ask a history book, and I love the language here. He didn't tell Sanji to read a history book, he said to ask a book, which in the One Piece world is technically possible. Objects can be imbued with human-type devil fruits and become capable of communicating with us, or you could even use Big Mom's soul powers to turn the book into a living, breathing homie. So perhaps at some point in the future, we will quite literally ask a book. And I'm also wondering if we may currently have such an opportunity on Elbaf. We have access to what has to be the world's oldest library, overseen by Biblo, a devil fruit-using owl whose age has been lost to time, and he could be from the Age of Heaven for all we know. So could Zunesha, the Thriller Bark monsters, the Sea Kings, and any of these supremely old and colossal beings that look like they belong in an ancient legend. But back to the Red Line, the idea of the Lunarians themselves could be based on Yatagarasu, a crow who served as the divine messenger of the sun goddess, and it's a being that appears in some of Japan's earliest writings and often serves as a symbol of the sun itself. It's also sometimes said to have fire-related powers, like the Lunarians. And while King, the only surviving Lunarian that we know of, has never mentioned Nika or the sun god directly, his purpose in life was to wait for Joy Boy to reappear, which is directly related to the legacy of the sun god. And fun fact, King's ancestral home on the Red Line is even marked by Eiichiro Oda in one of his earliest drawings of the One Piece world. This is a map that was made in 1999, and this was done because Oda needed to set this world in stone before the crew entered the Grand Line. He needed to know where they were going. And it contains a lot of curiously labeled locations that have either been changed or not explored yet, one of which is named King's House, which is very close to where Marijois is on the top of the Red Line, and I'd like to think that this is just Oda pointing out where King used to live. That's his house right there. It's almost certainly not. I just find the idea of identifying a small home on this giant world map quite adorable. But what I'll also say for the Red Line is that it's very much in keeping with the Shinto creation myth. The gods rose to the top and formed their civilization civilization, whilst the mortals sank to the lowest plane to form theirs. And this is an idea that appears in giant mythology as well, because our introduction to Elbaf was having the crew abducted by Rode, who inserted them into a diorama that he called the Land of Gods, populated by mortal humans with comparatively massive Elbathian animals that were each given the title of god, including the allegedly delicious rabbit named the Ear God. And of course, Rode himself took on the role of the Sun God. Although I should note that there is a slight difference in how these concepts are referred to, even though they sound pretty much exactly the same in English. The home of the Lunarian race is the Kami no Kuni, meaning Land of Gods, whereas Rode's diorama was called the Kamigami no Kuni, which means essentially the same thing, but Kamigami refers to a more clear plurality of gods. And on top of this, we also have the domain of gods, the Kamigami no Chi, which is where the world nobles reside at Marjois, which is of course the ancestral home of the Lunarians. But all of these names are references to the way this land was during the Age of Heaven. And there is a very popular theory that the world government or the 20 kingdoms created the Red Line, and that the One Piece will only be found when the Red Line is destroyed, thus uniting every sea on the planet into a literal One Piece. But it's looking more like the Red Line was created by the gods during the Age of Heaven, not the world government. And it's more likely that the 20 kingdoms created the Grand Line, aka the Sea Circle. And this marked the transition of power from the gods to the false gods that we now know as the world nobles. And this again is quite similar to the transition between the Age of Gods and the Age of Humanity in Shinto chronology. The point at which the Age of Gods becomes the Age of Humanity is with the ascension of Japan's first emperor Jimmu, said to descend from both the Sun Goddess and the Storm God. And the similarities between Jimmu and Imu, I mean, firstly you can hear it in the name, Imu sounds a lot like Jimmu, but the actual meaning of Jimmu's name can be two things. It can either mean divine might or god warrior. The second of which I find particularly intriguing because that is the title given to each of the 5 Elder Stars who serve Imu. They're all defined as the warrior gods of their respective fields. And it's even spelled with the exact same kanji, just reversed. When written in this order, the kanji reads as Jimmu, and when you flip them around, they read as Bunshin, literally meaning god of the military arts. But also, much like Leloucia, there's no evidence to suggest that Jimmu actually existed in real life, and he is considered a legend, very much like how Imu's existence is a secret lurking legend of the One Piece world. Although I should say that a character named Jimmu does appear in One Piece, but he's a filler character from a TV special, and his name is not derived from the first legendary Japanese emperor, because Jimmu also happens to be the Japanese way of saying the plain old boring English name Jim. So if there are any Jims watching right now, I'm sorry, but your parents just sort of gave up when it came to naming you. And Jim was also murdered, which is a bit wow for One Piece. Sometimes filler goes pretty hard. But there is a potential Imu-Jimmu connection being formed here, implying that Imu is the figure who triggered the transition between the Age of Heaven and the Age of the Sea Circle, which, given Imu's tendency to cause rising sea levels, is definitely not out of the question. However, there is one problem that we need to address, which is that as far as we're aware, the timeline doesn't match up. The Void Century occurred from the year 600 to the year 700 of the Sea Circle calendar. So unless Imu predates even that period, it was not his ascent, or at least not the formation of the world government, that marked the transition between the Age of Heaven and the Age of the Sea Circle. But there is another option, and this is a big elephant in the room, not literally like Zunesha, who can't fit in any rooms, but it's impossible to talk about this time period without mentioning the Great Kingdom, which was the primary power that existed prior to the alliance of the 20 kingdoms. And the other option is that the transition out of the Age of Heaven was marked by the rise of the Great Kingdom and whoever their leader or founder was, which, if I were to guess, whoever that person happened to be could also have been in possession of the Sun God Devil Fruit that would go on to be inherited by Joy Boy and eventually Luffy. Because the gods themselves may have vanished in our current age, but their powers and influence have not. We've talked to death on this channel about Luffy and the Nika Fruit, but many of the other mentioned gods also have Devil Fruit counterparts. For example, the Forest God manifests itself pretty damn powerfully in Green Bull's Devil Fruit. The Rain God is very much present in Dragon Storm powers, and there's no shortage of earth manipulating fruits that could account for a hidden or even fractured Earth God, which is one hypothesis for the shift between the eras. The gods disappeared, they went over there. But what they did right was they left their powers in the form of fictional fruit for humanity to use to prosper. And the first person to inherit the Sun God's abilities was whoever founded the Great Kingdom, the Jimmu of this story. And just as a quick thing here, do you remember that fancy Sun Crow Yatagarasu? Well, he was the being that guided Jimmu to the place where his nation would be established, which would give us the link between our Joy Boy / Sun God and the Lunarian people. And in lieu of Nika himself, the Lunarians are consistently waiting for the next mortal being to have inherited Nika's powers. Plus, Jimmu was both a descendant of the Sun and Storm gods, which definitely definitely suits the idea of the Will of D a lot better. A clan waiting for a person to awaken the sun god fruit, as well as the power to always cause a storm in the world with their actions. And you can also see some potential modern day hints at this idea with Luffy and Dragon. Luffy's father appears to be the closest thing we have to a storm god in the series with his wild weather powers. Although that may not necessarily be true, because Imu himself quite clearly resembles an Umibozu, a figure often depicted of pure darkness with two prominent eyes that lurks in the oceans. And from here on out, just bear in mind that this is a hypothesis. I will not apply the labels of good and evil at all because we understand too little about all of this to begin with. And what I'm about to tell you is so preposterous that you may even burst into laughter. However, you have the right to know. Imu could be the last remaining actual god from the Age of Heaven. A stubborn, bitter Umibozu who once clashed with Nika in the old world, and after the transition to the Age of the Sea Circle, made it his mission to destroy the legacy of Nika, which included Joy Boy, the Great Kingdom, the Land of the Gods, which he usurped and transformed into his own kingdom of Marijois, which was a process that took him about 600 years to achieve, but one that still has yet to be fully completed because he still hasn't wiped out the entirety of the Will of D, and specifically Monkey D. Luffy. And so when we see absolutely wild stuff like black magic spell circles, that might not be a devil fruit. This could be the power of an actual god, one of the oldest beings on the One Piece planet. Or alternatively, perhaps Imu is also a proxy. Like Joy Boy and Luffy with the sun god powers, Imu inherited the ability of Nika's enemy during the Age of Heaven. So there's a lot of options and a ton of stuff in this video that's going to turn out to be incorrect, but at the moment, this is the very best that we can do to speculate on the events and the legacy of the Age of Heaven.